All right, folks, this is Charlita. Welcome to the webinar, and we just wanted to go over a few tips to minimize some of the troubleshooting later on, so hopefully you can have a quality experience. Some of these things you may have seen before, but we've added a few more tips. Having a high-speed connection, and we do recommend a direct cable cord, DSL, rather than wireless. Some people have a fine experience on wireless, but if there's any connection troubles, we recommend the cord. We also found that using Internet Explorer or Mozilla Firefox helps to make sure that sharing comes through correctly. Chrome is not recommended. And then the latest version of Adobe Flash Player, of course, where you can download a copy. Always good speakers or headphones. Closing all other internet programs and applications during the webinar. Multitasking can affect your connection, so something else to consider. And then if you want to test your settings, your speed, your system connection, you can click on the link tinyurl.com, add in test. So that's good. If you do have further difficulties, feel free to call me. And do know that if there's any trouble viewing it, we'll send you the links for the recording of it later on within a week, and probably quicker. So yeah. Remember that you can add comments in the chat box at any time, and anticipate that there'll be times where we ask questions during the presentation. So be ready to participate and think ahead of questions you might have. All right.
And this is Chet, and let me add my welcome to Charlita. Thanks so much for joining us. We've got a lot of faithful folk who have attended many of these webinars, and we're really glad you're back. And if you're new to this, we hope that you will have a good experience with it. We've got a lot to do tonight, so I want to get right to it. But I do want to welcome, we've got at least 4 different group viewings tonight. There's a group at the Kairos office in Toronto. Thank you, Susie and Jennifer, for organizing that. The faithful Portland crew in up there in Oregon with Solveig, who hosted me a couple of weeks ago to do some of this same material, so we're glad you're back. Elkhart, Indiana, our longtime folk meeting in Joanna Shank's living room. Welcome to you all, and there's also, looks like there's a group in Kitchener-Waterloo in Canada. So we got all of North America represented. We also have someone signed on in Norway, where it is dark 30 right now. But we're really glad that Oliver Bjørge is with us. That said, we're gonna get right to it. This is a favorite piece of mine that I've been working on for a while. Actually, the first time I presented it was at the National Cathedral in 2005 when I was working with a conversation between the Emmaus Road text and the jazz musician Warren Cooper. And I just got to tell you, it was an amazing experience. If you've been to the National Cathedral, you know what a huge place it is in Washington, D.C. And Brother Warren's voice filled up that entire space. It was amazing. If you're interested in the recording of that, you'll get the content tonight, but if you want to hear Warren's voice, you have the URL both on your slide and up in your notes section. I do want to make sure you see the Notes 5 box there, which will have a few resources listed as we go along. As I mentioned 10 days ago, I was up in Portland and had another opportunity to do this piece as a conversation with jazz musicians, in this case with Augustana Lutheran Church's in-house jazz combo. So really delighted to have these experiences. There will be no jazz music tonight other than what you heard at the beginning, but there's plenty of content to get to. I want to begin tonight by acknowledging the passing of someone who was a mentor to many of us and a spiritual director to many of us, Gordon Cosby, the founder of Church of the Savior, the oldest alternative church experiment in the history of the United States. Gordon was 95 when he passed on the vernal equinox this year, and it's a great passing of one of the great ones. A few years ago, when I was meeting with him, he looked at me with that intense gaze and said, "This moment is crucial, with great potential for creativity or disaster. It's an all hands on deck time." So, in memory of Gordon and with that sort of conviction, we call his spirit to accompany us on this journey. Speaking of passings, today is the anniversary of the passing of another great prophet, Cesar Chavez, here in California. He passed away in 1993, 20 years ago today. I actually had the great honor of attending his memorial service at one of the California missions. It was an amazing event, and I don't think Cesar Chavez needs any introduction, but we also remember him today. So, surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, we move to talk about Easter, and happy Eastertide to you. We're in the late season of Eastertide now. You know, for our churches in the Northern Hemisphere, that would be all of us on the call tonight, the fact that Eastertide is celebrated in the heart of springtime has been a rather mixed blessing. On one hand, there's a powerful resonance between the season of surging new life in nature. Here's a picture of the California golden poppies that are exploding just outside our office in our yard. A correlation between all of that surging life and the story of Christ's resurrection. Some of our liturgies actually celebrate this synergy. For example, the beautiful Celtic tradition of the flowering cross. Folks in Toronto, I know some of you celebrated this in your liturgies. Or for that matter, the more pagan Easter egg hunt. But the subversive meaning and power of our gospel Easter story has often been lost amidst our churchly traditions and tendencies to sugarcoat, or we should probably say chocolate cover, this highest of our Christian holy days. Eastertide is the central feast of the Christian year, and yet it is often buried under sentimentality and fabulous hats. In particular, our struggling churches take care not to do or say anything controversial on this day, which after all is one of the 2 Sundays of the year that we can count on nominal Christians filling the pews. So Easter does tend to be celebrated in a way that is maximally insulated from history, from gospel history, and from our own history. As a consequence of this chocolate coating, the Church's public theology of Easter is experiencing diminishing returns, and most people find it much less compelling than the other more popular rites of spring, such as, say, March Madness or the Oscars or college spring break shenanigans. We Christians have forgotten that the resurrection accounts in our Gospels took place under a shadow of death, as real as war or climate change or the struggle for food justice or health care or against human trafficking. The specters that define our life today. Our Bible stories, as you all are used to hearing me say, do not take place in Disneyland. They narrate a world just like our own, full of poverty and oppression and intrigue. That's why these stories offer us true hope to resist the reign of death, rather than some sort of religious inoculation against its consequences. So to recover this tough character of our scriptures demands a little recontextualization. To begin with, let's remind ourselves of our own historical moment. Just a little less than a month ago, we commemorated the 10th anniversary of the start of the Second Gulf War in Iraq. And I wonder, in the Sundays since March 20th, how many of our churches took the opportunity to debrief that debacle, to review the fact that between March of 03 and December of last year, there were more than 120,000 civilian deaths in Iraq and over 50,000 combatant deaths from the violence. Did we talk about in our churches the fact that today veterans aged 20 to 24 who served in the war on terror have the highest suicide rate of all vets, between 2 and 4 times higher than civilians of the same age, and that's not even counting those who have attempted suicide. At least 5 members of the armed forces were hospitalized every minute for attempted suicide in 2009. On average, 18 vets a day take their own lives. Or have we reflected on the huge environmental costs of both Gulf Wars through oil fires and the destruction of sensitive desert and marshland habitats? Or more to the point of tonight's theme, 3 weeks ago we also commemorated the 45th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Did we take the opportunity in our churches to wrestle with the continuing meaning of his life and his death? Did we dare look at, for example, the evidence that King was killed by the U.S. government? Now, many bristle at this suggestion even still, so it's important to remind us that in the fall of 1999, the King family, long convinced that James Earl Ray did not act alone, brought a civil suit to the Circuit Court of Shelby County, Tennessee, 30th Judicial District in Memphis, where King was killed, in order to discover the facts of Martin's murder. For a month, a jury of 12 peers, American citizens, heard and reviewed the extensive testimony and evidence, which had never been before tested under an oath in a court of law. It took the jury only an hour and a half to find that a conspiracy to kill Dr. King did in fact exist, and that it involved agents of the governments of the city of Memphis, the state of Tennessee, and the U.S. government, and that James Earl Ray was not the triggerman. News? Well, that's because it didn't make the front page of any U.S. newspaper. It was voted as the most underreported story of 1999. If you're interested in learning more about this, it's written up in William Pepper's book, An Act of State. And Charlotte, if you scroll down a little bit, folks will see that under the notes box. So these are the realities of our lives. Did our churches understand the government's motive behind this public crime? The fact that exactly 1 year before Dr. King's assassination, almost to the hour, King had spoken out publicly for the first time openly and unequivocally against the Vietnam War, calling it one of the most unjust wars that has ever been fought in the history of the world. In this famous Beyond Vietnam speech of 1967, King articulated his great critique of the three giant triplets of militarism, racism, and poverty, and we will end tonight's presentation by revisiting this amazing public oratory. But none of this seems quite appropriate for Easter. Easter is a time of joy and family and, glazed ham. So that's a little bit of our dilemma as Christians in the modern world. And we're going to take a brief break here, and those of you who are alone at home with your computer can maybe chat your thoughts into the chat function. Those of you who are in groups, I encourage you to maybe go around in a circle and share ways in which, in your experience, the great feast of Easter has been domesticated. So just let's take a minute or two and go around the horn and share with each other some of the ways in which these things have been domesticated in your experience. And if some of you want to chat some of that into the chat box, that would be great. We'll take just a minute. So thanks for these thoughtful responses, and feel free to keep typing them in as you wish. Not only the bunnies, but sort of the same stories being preached year after year. Easter brunch. Weldon in Seattle talking about the triumphal entry and the continuing triumphalness of Easter Sunday. Jeremy, a new member of our webinar crew, tuning in from Washington, D.C. Welcome, Jeremy. Is talking about the great over-spiritualization of resurrection, and so on. Okay, so we live under the shadow of not only death and destruction, but also under the shadow of domestication and mystification in our tradition. So in light of that, because we're in the year of Luke, we want to take particularly a careful look at Luke's great Easter story, the road to Emmaus. It's a beloved story to many of us. It's perhaps the church's most beloved Easter text. It's a moving story that narrates a conversation between an unrecognized Jesus and two obscure disciples. As the exchange along the road will make perfectly clear, as we'll see, Jesus' execution presented a crushing blow to the movement that he founded, a chilling shadow of death. Nevertheless, this little vignette has managed to become profoundly sentimentalized in our churches. It's every bit as domesticated in our pious tradition as, for example, the story of the Last Supper. Here is an image of Da Vinci's famous Last Supper. That's what immediately comes to mind when we think of the Last Supper. As one art critic has put it, when we think of the Last Supper, we only see Da Vinci's representation. The upper room appears in this famous painting and tapestry as a serene moment of beatific communion in a chapel-like setting. But this image, which is so deeply ingrained on our religious consciousness, could not be further from the scene narrated in the Gospels. There we find a frantic, furtive, clandestine gathering of hunted fugitives on the verge of a nervous breakdown, hiding out in the attic of a safe house in Jerusalem. The scene is held together only by a determined Jesus, even though he knows that his companions will soon abandon him when the authorities come after him. So that's the kind of chocolate covering that goes way, way back in our tradition. It also obviously obscures the road to the Emmaus story. The road to Emmaus exists in popular churchly imagination as a contemplative stroll through a shaded landscape, a casual tete-a-tete delightfully interrupted by the risen Lord. In other words, it looks like this. This is a famous religious painting by Swiss pietist artist Robert Zund in the 19th century, in which the warm and tranquil Emmaus Road scene is concocted as if by the Hudson River School of Romantic Art, or Disneyland. This is the image that's in our consciousness for so many of us when we think of the Emmaus Road. But the story told in Luke's Gospel is hardly contemplative. Only 48 hours earlier, Jesus of Nazareth had been summarily executed by the Roman military in a fashion all too familiar to Palestinian Jews of the time, as a dissident prosecuted for resisting the imperial occupation. A little narrative common sense, therefore, would suggest that the two disciples in our story would be neither leisurely nor calmly reflective at this particular moment. Rather, they would be on the lam, hustling down a back road, getting the hell out of Dodge so they won't meet the same fate as their leader. Now, as we so often do on these webinars, we just need to briefly remind ourselves of the political reality of the first century in Roman-occupied Palestine. This is a piece of Roman propaganda from the 3rd century in another outpost of empire, northern England, and it's a dedication plaque that's flanked by relief carvings. At left is the Roman god of war Mars brandishing a spear, and at right the mythological hero Hercules holding a club. At bottom is a running boar, symbol of the 20th Legion, and that's to whom this plaque is dedicated. The 20th Legion, by the way, was stationed not only in the Celtic colonies, but also in Palestine. It was the counterinsurgency specialists of the Roman military. These are coins that were minted just prior to the writing of Luke's Gospel. They were minted just after the destruction of Jerusalem by the Roman military in the year 70 of the Common Era. This is the Judea Capta series of coins, and it pictures Judah as a defeated woman with her hands tied behind her back under a palm tree, symbol of Palestine. On the reverse side of the coin is a Roman centurion standing victoriously over the woman with the phrase, captive Judea. So this was the political and social and political and psychic reality of Jews under the Roman Empire, and it is into this reality that Luke is speaking his story. So that tells us a little bit more about the Emmaus Road story. I wanted to go through this story verse by verse so we can try to desentimentalize it. We're told that that very day, two of them were going to a village named Emmaus. I suppose these two are trying to, how does the Pentagon put it, melt into the countryside. Their destination is kind of interesting. Emmaus a village so obscure that it receives no other mention in the Scriptures. There are, however, 4 different traditions outside of the Bible concerning its location, and we're told in the book of Maccabees that it was a site where the vastly outnumbered Jewish guerrillas heroically defeated the Syrian invaders a few centuries before the time of the Emmaus Road story in Luke. The historian Josephus, a contemporary of Luke's, also notes that the victorious Roman Emperor Vespasian, just a few years after destroying Jerusalem and crushing the Judean revolt in the year 70, made a political point by settling 800 Roman military veterans at a place called Emmaus. So these references suggest that our little village had a reputation for homegrown resistance, which the empire felt some need to control by turning it into a military colony. This scenario is certainly familiar in our own imperial context. So that gives us a little bit of spatial reality. This is a scene that I think is more apt, an alternative way to imagine the Emmaus Road story. This is a painting in 1831 of fugitive slaves hustling through a swamp being pursued by would-be captors. Now, we don't think of this as religious art, but I would submit that this is far more the tenor of the Emmaus Road story. In fact, we're told by Luke that these 2 disciples were talking with each other about all the things that had happened. I'll bet they were hightailing it for the border, laying low in the swamps. No doubt. Now, this verb, or the phrase, all the things that had happened, is kind of a technical phrase in the gospel tradition, referring specifically to the arrest, trial, and execution of Jesus, or to the parallel sufferings of disciples later in the New Testament. So I'm thinking that the Emmaus Road conversation was likely an animated one, between labored breaths and anxious glancing over the shoulder. These disciples were probably blaming each other for the mess they'd gotten into, wondering what their next move might be, lamenting Roman kangaroo justice, cursing the colonizers, cursing Jesus for failing to deliver on his promises of a new social order. They had a lot to talk about, all right. The Greek verb homilun, from which we get our term homiletics, that's serious stuff. That's a serious, sober conversation. This is no peripatetic philosophical wander. It's a grief-laden, scared shitless, contentious debriefing under the shadow of death. And hopefully that snaps a little bit more into focus what we're dealing with here. A couple of simple exegetical notes confirm our suspicions. First of all, the distinctly Lucan verb for discussion, as I mentioned, homilun. This appears only 2 other times in the New Testament, both in the book of Acts. In Acts 20:11, it describes Paul's sobering farewell sermon at Troas, a serious through-the-night conversation about how the young movement could survive its persecution. In Acts 24:26, it refers to Paul's conversation with the Roman governor Felix concerning justice and the coming judgment, a discussion, we're told, that scared that ruler to death. So this clearly refers to weighty matters, not light banter. Moreover, in the New Testament, the verb syzetein almost always connotes a passionate dispute. So the disciples' preoccupation with this intense, desperate discussion may explain why they didn't immediately recognize their teacher. Now, Daniel Berrigan has suggested that perhaps they didn't know Jesus because he was simply so beat up and disfigured by his tortures. Indeed, Luke later tells us in this account that the risen Jesus' scars were still visible, and believe me, they weren't surgical scars the way that they appear in religious art. After all, we're told Jesus had been to hell and back, so it's not unlikely that they didn't recognize him. It also may be that Luke is working here with the Midrashic traditions of the incognito second coming. The ancient rabbis often speculated that the prophet Elijah or Messiah himself would return anonymously to see if the world were ready to receive him. In any case, they don't understand that it's Jesus, and the stranger's response makes it clear that he's walked in on a heated debate. Verse 17 reads literally, "What words were you throwing back and forth at each other while you were making your way along?" And they looked gloomy. Jesus perceives that these poor brothers are struggling with each other. They're in a bad mood. And Cleopas' retort betrays a distinctly impatient tone. "You're the only one in Jerusalem who doesn't know what's been going down these last few days, clueless?" It's a rather dry remark, or maybe he's exhibiting a wary defensiveness. After all, they're fugitives, and who is this unknown dude asking prying questions? Well, now that Luke has established sufficient angst in the scene, we can detect a certain delicious irony in how the stranger plays dumb, given what he's just been through. "Huh?" he says with a straight face. "Do tell." Biblical writers are not without irony and humor. Cleopas passionately, if a bit recklessly, launches into the whole sordid affair. How Jesus of Nazareth had resuscitated the prophetic tradition, igniting hope in people longing for liberation and shalom, and how his own leaders, bloody collaborators, had railroaded him and sold him out to the imperial oppressors who had strung him up. Finally, his frustration boils over. "And we had trusted," that's the true meaning of the Greek verb elpizomen. "We had trusted that he was the one who was actually going to liberate Israel." Cleopas' bitter disappointment, his sense of betrayal, his confusion is palpable. It's not difficult to feel empathy for him. I mean, put yourself in Cleopas' shoes. He'd staked his life on the hope that this messianic movement, unlike so many others in recent generations, would finally break the yoke of oppression that had strangled his people for centuries. He'd committed himself to the risky business of challenging the native aristocracy and their imperial overlords with Jesus. But things had turned out all wrong. Jesus' march on Jerusalem had resulted not in a popular uprising toppling tyrant statues on global television, but instead had come crashing down in a vicious counterinsurgent thrust by the colonizers. Their leader had been publicly executed. They had fled for their lives, an all-points bulletin hanging over their heads. And if that weren't enough, miserable Cleopas concludes his sad tale by relating with apparent aggravation a rumor circulating among some of his dispirited companions, women's rumors, mind you, about visions of angels and an empty tomb. The authorities had probably hijacked Jesus' body. Everything was falling apart. The movement was in disarray, and they'd been arguing about it all day, and frankly, he'd had it. Perhaps then, this image is more appropriate than Zun's painting to give us a feel for the Emmaus Road story. This photo was taken at the Lorraine Motel one day after Dr. King's assassination. It more accurately captures the hard terrain of life under the shadow of death. It shouldn't be difficult for us to imagine this traumatizing scene. How would King's companions have been feeling on April 6, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee? We know now that in this famous photo of those men frantically gesturing toward the shooter from the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, we know that the man kneeling over King was a government agent. You see, this is the real world of COINTELPRO and conspiracy, of imperial justice meted out by good old boys who can hardly contain their glee at the prophet's demise, of stern official calls for law and order in the wake of this tragedy by the very ones who engineered it. You see, Memphis was on lockdown in the wake of King's assassination, and we'd better believe that King's lieutenants were going crazy trying to figure out what had really gone down and why and how had their leader been gunned down and who was behind it and what it meant for the movement and whether they might be next on the hit list. Try to enter in with your imagination to that day. You see, just as Jesus had entered Jerusalem to the acclaim of peasants on Palm Sunday, so Dr. King had come to Memphis to support the sanitation workers' strike in 1968, a commitment of solidarity that brought victory to the workers, but only tragedy to King and the nation. So the Emmaus Road story takes place in the real world of popular movements being aborted in the face of state repression. It's hardly a stroll in the park. But in this world, this is the world the Bible inhabits. We North American Christians rarely grapple with such realities. We are too preoccupied with institutional survival to entertain the possibility that our whole nation might be captive to the same powers that took out Jesus and King. We talk about power in the name of Jesus, but are too timid to interrogate public addiction or high corporate crime. We speculate blithely about the last days while endorsing world historic shifts in U.S. military and economic policies that are chewing up millions of the lives we say God loves, that are destroying the land and the sea and the air that we say God created. We're content to keep our heads down and examine the finer points of doctrine or liturgy or church demographics, well insulated from the shadow of death. What I'd like to invite you now to do in our second break is again chatting individually or talking in the groups to name tense historic moments that you have experienced in your life when everyone was on edge because of what had happened. Maybe it's a local drama, maybe it's a national drama or an international drama. Obviously, right in the wake of 9/11 is the thing that comes to mind for many Americans. But I'd like you just to take a minute and text or talk in your circles about moments that you felt this kind of tenseness, this kind of anxiety and uncertainty and fear. Yes. Andrew McLeod up in the Bay Area reminding us obviously of what just went down in Boston. I'm going to let you all chat for a minute while I visit the restroom. So again, feel free to keep chatting here. All right, so these are traumatizing events, and if we can imagine our way into that, we can begin to start walking the Emmaus Road in a fashion that is not overly spiritualized. And I think it's significant that in the midst of all this trauma, like the ones we're naming, Luke's Jesus actually embraces it all. His response to Cleopas is instructive. He doesn't scold him for mixing religion and politics. He doesn't redirect him to turn inwards to a life of the Spirit. He doesn't console him with pat theories of history. Instead, Jesus simply walks with these poor dudes for a few miles, listening to their pain, inquiring. And then he responds with, of all things, a Bible study. This is something which makes modern theological liberals blush, yet which hardly fits the hermeneutical program of modern conservatives. To be precise, this is the first recorded Bible study in the life of the Easter Church, a church that hasn't even been born on Pentecost yet. Okay, fellas, says Jesus, it's a bad time, all right, I get it. So open your Bibles to the prophets and let's read history together under the shadow of death. Luke tells us that Jesus addresses these fit-to-be-tied disciples as fools. Now, the Greek term anontoi refers simply to those of us who just don't quite get it yet, who find the truth as yet unintelligible, as in Romans 1 or Galatians 3. Jesus knows that the hearts of these disciples are slow or sluggish, as indeed are ours, because we, like Cleopas and company, are forever refusing to embrace the counterintuitive wisdom of the Hebrew prophets. Because the prophets tell us to defend the poor, but we are lionizing the rich. The prophets tell us that horses and chariots cannot save us, but we are transfixed by the apparent omnipotence of modern military technology. The prophets tell us to forego idolatry, but we compulsively fetishize the work of our own hands. Above all, the prophets warn us that the way of liberation in the world locked down by the spiral of violence, the way to redemption in a world of enslaving addictions, the way to true transformation in a world deadened in conscience and numbed by conformity, is the way of nonviolent, creative, and costly love. But we who are slow of heart, a euphemism really for not having enough courage, we instead remain fiercely loyal to ever more fabulous myths of redemptive violence and practices of narcissism and delusions of our own nobility. We ignore or marginalize or jail the prophets. Yeah, I'm talking about all of us. We're all part of societies that do that. But what we balk at most is the stranger's punchline, this query upon which our theological reading of history balances. Was it not necessary that Messiah should suffer? Now, the Greek term "ede" here is the imperfect form of a technical apocalyptic term that appears throughout the New Testament. It refers to the fact that an official reaction to prophetic witness is inevitable. So I think necessary is a little unfortunate. It's not a rhetorical question for Christological catechizing about cosmic propitiation, the way traditional atonement theories have it. Rather, it's the ultimate challenge to our deepest assumptions about society and the cosmos, the taproot counter-assertion that unmasks our profound captivity to the logic of domination and retributive justice. The prophet's death is not necessary, given the character of God. Rather, it is inevitable, given the character of the state. No one who pays attention to history can dispute the truth of this assertion. Nevertheless, we North Americans, we keep wanting the good guys to win. So much so that we're forced to make believe that even the worst sort of characters are the good guys, such as our own presidents and prime ministers and generals. We strive to manage history from the top down, to control it with our technologies, to win all battles with overwhelming power. But the prophets keep talking about revolution from the bottom up, the wisdom of outsiders, the power of the least. Like the disciples in Luke's story, we Christians, we understand enough to acknowledge that Jesus lived a prophet's life, but we don't understand enough to recognize the historically redemptive and inevitable power of his prophet's death. And that's why, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, Jesus interpreted to them the scriptures. Verse 27. The verb here is dia hermeneuin, and every other time it appears in the New Testament, it means to translate something into one's own native tongue, as in, for example, Acts 9. In 1 Corinthians 12, it means interpreting ecstatic languages into intelligible speech. In other words, Jesus is patiently translating the counterintuitive, prophetic, biblical wisdom into the plainest possible terms so that these demoralized disciples can get it. And that, I want to suggest, is the task of our theological reflection during the season of Easter under the shadow of death, then and now. More than any other gospel writer, Luke emphasizes Israel's prophets as his own interpretive lens. You see some of them here, from the Magnificat to Jesus' first sermon in the Nazareth synagogue, to Jesus' Sermon on the Plain. There's this consistent emphasis on the prophetic lens, the prophetic hermeneutic. Similarly, in chapters 7 and 9 and 13 and 18, we have this emphasis on the prophet in our midst, on John the Baptist as a great prophet, of the prophets being with the cloud of witnesses, and ultimately in chapter 18, the human one going the way of the prophets as he goes up to Jerusalem. These prophets are the ones who throughout national history, then and now, engaged the way things were with a vision of the way things could and should be. The prophets are the ones who question authority, who make trouble, who refuse to settle, who interrupt business as usual, who speak truth to power, give voice to the voiceless. They're the ones who stir up the troops, make the natives restless, picket presidential palaces, question foreign policies based on military and economic domination, and for their trouble, they're accused of treason in times of national war-making. And for being the inconvenient conscience of the nation, the prophets are jailed or exiled or killed. And then once they are safely disposed of, then they get the national holiday. Once canonized, they get the streets named after them, only to be thereafter ignored by their public patrons. Luke's Jesus makes this point crystal clear in his tirade against this sort of duplicity, and this is a key hermeneutic of how we read history. In chapter 11, Luke's Jesus goes on a rant. Woe to you, scribes, you who build the tombs of the prophets whom your ancestors killed. You are witnesses and approved of the deeds of your ancestors. They killed them. You build their monuments. Therefore, the Sophia of God says, I will send them prophets and apostles, some of whom they will kill and persecute. And then he goes on a long list from Abel to Zechariah, literally A to Z in biblical history. And what was true then continues to be true today, from Sitting Bull to Martin King. But it's the prophets themselves, not their corporate-sponsored hagiographies, who teach us how the collective story should be read. That is the stranger's argument. Their witness, however maligned or co-opted by those in power, this is the key to understanding both the biblical tradition and our own history. That's why it was inevitable that Messiah would follow in their footsteps. Again, I want to invite you for a quick minute to just name the prophets who you look to, the prophets who we need to be paying attention to. Just take a minute and call them out, as it were. So I'll just name a few of the ones that we are bearing witness to. Amos, Oscar Romero, Gandhi, Mother Teresa, Bell Hooks, Gordon Cosby, Clarence Jordan, Rachel Carson, Bill McKibben, Sandra Steingruber, Jose Maria Arizmendiarreta, a great name, Father Lorenzo Guetti, Tim Wise, Cornel West, Hosea. Again, we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. And let those names keep flowing. So, this is the first half of the story of the Emmaus Road. And in it, the inaugural appearance of the risen Christ is in the form of a stranger. At the end of this part of the narrative, the day is drawing to a close, and we're told the disciples literally have to force Jesus to come lodge with them. I'm sorry that the text is a little cut off on this slide. They understand that after the Roman curfew falls, it would be particularly dangerous for the traveler, and so they really have to strongly urge the stranger to come in out of the dark and take safety in the safe house. Now comes really the most famous part of the story, where Jesus is famously revealed in the breaking of the bread. This is the part of the story that most homilies, most preaching focuses on. I want to pause here to look at a little bit of Christian art. This is Caravaggio's famous Supper at Emmaus, and I want you to notice how female Jesus looks and how rough the disciples are, truly of peasant stock. Well, apparently the church authorities in the Renaissance also thought that it was a little bit too feminine, so they made Caravaggio redo it so that Jesus was more properly male, and the disciples a little less rough-hewn. You know, art is always very political as well as very cultural. I want to show one other image of the moment of the breaking of the bread. This is by the contemporary Filipino artist Emmanuel Garabay. I love his rendition. He writes about it this way. The figure at the center is a woman, though she could be mistaken for a man because she has short hair. She's drinking with the two fellas and telling a joke, and everybody around her is laughing. But the real reason they're laughing is because these Filipinos, all along, they thought that Jesus was a man and a Caucasian. All of the conventional concepts. But I have a different image of Jesus, says Garibay, that of a very ordinary-looking Filipino woman who drinks with the dudes and has stories to tell. It is very common among Filipinos to laugh at their mistakes. This is a beautiful rendition of the revelation of Christ in the breaking of the bread, inviting us to apprehend Easter in terms of surprise and delight, even as our preconceptions dissolve in the face of what Julia Esquivel famously called being threatened by resurrection. Indeed, the Eucharistic Epiphany that is narrated at the center of the Emmaus Road text is beautiful and haunting. And it's good that it is at the center of a lot of our preaching, but here tonight we're focusing on the two aspects of the Emmaus Road that bookend this middle, which really suggests that they are the more important point. And what I mean by that is this. What we're told, the next line is, they're saying to each other, were not our hearts burning within us while he was on the road opening up the Scriptures? Now this verb, dianoigo, in every other appearance in the Gospels, refers to the opening up of deaf ears, or of a closed womb, or of blind eyes, or even of hardened hearts in Acts 16. This underlines the point of the Emmaus Road conversation. Our perspective on traumatic historic events is not ultimately a matter of rational persuasion, but of breaking through denial, blind eyes, deaf ears, hard hearts, the difficult truth of discipleship under the shadow of death. And when our hearts are truly opened, then they burn with renewed commitment. So it's very significant that Luke wants to emphasize the opening of Scriptures even more than the mystical moment of Eucharistic communion. I find that actually quite astonishing. With this jolt of recognition, revelation, now Luke's narrative reverses directions. The fugitive disciples now turn heel and return to the capital city from which they were fleeing to face its dangers. The very next scene shows us that the fractured community is regathering, and the Emmaus Road pair are relating their experiences to the other disciples, and as they are doing it, Jesus again appears to the whole group. Now, Luke reports that here in this second epiphany, the disciples were terrified and awestruck. And I want to pay attention to these two Greek adjectives. The first one is toeu, which means in the active mood to terrify, and in the passive mood used here to be terrified. The only other time it appears in the New Testament is in Luke 21:9. When you hear of wars and upheavals, do not be terrified. These things are inevitable. It's understandable that the disciples would be terrified. Crucifixion was the preeminent form of Roman state terrorism, after all. This gruesome form of public execution, reserved only for political dissidents, had only one public function: to intimidate those in the occupied territories, in the name, of course, of imperial national security. So it was a very effective way of broadcasting the message, look what happens to those who think they can challenge the sovereignty of Caesar. Such practices, of course, persist today in our imperial world. They are terrifying. They are tortuous. But the other adjective Luke uses is emphobos, awestruck. In the New Testament, this is reserved for connoting awe in the presence of God or the risen Christ. So, on the one hand, these disciples are cowering before a fearful state. On the other hand, they're reeling before the unimaginable possibility that Rome's ultimate form of social control had not succeeded in defeating Jesus. Now, I want to suggest here that the prospect of Jesus' resurrection is generating strong reaction here, not because corpse resuscitation upset the laws of nature. No, that's a problem only for modern folk, and it mostly generates skepticism. No, the resurrection in this story is overwhelming to the disciples because it signals that Jesus' way had been vindicated by God, especially that most difficult bit about dying for the cause rather than killing for the cause. This vocabulary suggests that the disciples were caught between these two types of fear: the terror of the state, particularly in times of war, and the awe that comes in the presence of divine power. How contemporary sounding this dilemma is in our world, riddled with terrorism, both official and ad hoc. It poses a revealing question to us, sharpened intensely by this last Iraq war. Who generates shock and awe in our lives? Is it the Pentagon's power of death over life, or the biblical God's power of life over death? This is the preeminent theological question for our time. And I want us just to take 30 seconds of silence as we ponder this dilemma. Well, the last scene in the Emmaus Road triptych is almost whimsical, as Jesus tries to convince his friends that he's not a ghost. This is now the second time in the story that he's gone unrecognized. This is a pretty poignant part of the story. He's asking them to touch his body, to commune with his wounds, the sign of torture at the hands of the Roman state. This is no spiritualized tradition. This is a tradition that communes with suffering. And then we're told that he asks for something to eat. I love this. He's tired. You can imagine him saying, "Man, it's been a long couple of days I've been through. Anybody got a sandwich for it, brother?" The emphasis here is on a real body that hungers, that continues to bear the wounds of struggle. Frankly, I think that about 100% of our religious art of the glorified, resurrected Christ has entirely missed the point. First of all, it's a spiritualized body with surgical wounds, not a beat-up body. Ours is a somatic tradition. And in that vein, Susie Henderson, who's on the webinar tonight there in Toronto, who's doing some wonderful work in our theological studies, has wondered about the cultural impact of this scene of the risen Christ sharing lunch with the disciples. She speculates whether or not it might be a reference to the Jewish cult of the dead, which, according to some reading that she's done, was a regular practice, although a private practice, in which Jews would go and eat at the tombs of their beloved who had passed. On the books, these kinds of practices were banned as a violation of purity, but the archaeological evidence says otherwise, Susie reports. Now, Susie further notes that it wasn't long before Christian practices developed similarly, and out of that, in the early church, came a sort of cult of the saints, a ritual reverence for the dead, incorporating ancient traditions of food on the altar of remembrance of loved ones. So that's kind of an interesting evolution to the tradition of All Saints Dia de los Muertos, which we looked at in a webinar last fall, in which Susie talked with us about her. So Kairos folks there in Toronto, be sure and talk to Susie about the investigation that she's doing in the tradition of death doula. And I think it is very, very interesting theologically, Susie, that we have this picnic right in the middle of the Emmaus Road story. So thanks for highlighting that. And after breaking the fast that he had declared at the Last Supper, if you remember, back in Luke 22, Jesus then resumes the Bible study that he had begun on the road to Emmaus. So again, I want to emphasize that on the Emmaus Road story, you got two Bible studies, the one on the road and then the one after the double Epiphany. But both of them are about the Moses and the prophets. And note again that for a second time we're told Jesus opened up, there's that verb again, dianoigo, the opening of the eyes of the blind, so that they might understand the Scriptures. Again, it's opening of the faculties of perception that have been shut down by empire. Now, the verb to understand here, suniemi, is kind of an interesting verb in the New Testament. I would paraphrase it as connecting the dots. It's bringing together all of the data. It's usually used in the New Testament usually to describe the many situations in which disciples are actually unable to connect the dots. So Jesus is trying to get us to understand what's going on in this traumatic, historic moment. Both of these verbs, interestingly, are connected in the Gospels with the story of the call of Isaiah. So Luke refers to Isaiah 6 in Luke 8 and again in Acts 28. Jesus is reminding his followers of something that the great prophet long ago stipulated. That is, people will oppose the Word of God because it challenges us to change. And what we resist most fiercely is, again, that terrible truth that it is inevitable that Messiah should suffer at the hands of the authorities. We just don't want to see history that way. But because we live in denial, we get history wrong, and when we get history wrong, we're on the wrong side of history. Because Jesus' prophetic vocation and fate is one that we as disciples are invited to share, so that Luke closes his story with the phrase, "It is written that Messiah should suffer, and that repentance and forgiveness of sins," that is, turning history around, "should be proclaimed in his name to all nations. And you are witnesses of these things." So not only are we inheriting Christ's vocation of proclamation, but we are invited to be witnesses. Now, as you know, the Greek term martyres means where we get our term martyr from. That is, we too are called to embrace the cost of this discipleship. Problem is, everybody in America wants to be a millionaire. Don't nobody want to be a martyr. And that's the rub. So, what have we learned here from this not-so-casual stroll along the Emmaus Road? I want to point to 5 learnings. First of all, the resurrected Jesus appears first as a stranger, indeed a stranger in need of hospitality. Let this be a Christological lesson to our churches. First and foremost, Christ appears unrecognized. This is Timothy Schmaltz's bronze sculpture entitled Homeless Jesus. It was a statue that was rejected by both St. Michael's Cathedral in Toronto and St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, before finally being installed near the entrance to the Jesuit Regis College at the University of Toronto. Homeless Jesus had no home, Schmaltz told the Toronto Star. People thought it might be too controversial or not an appropriate image. Our colleague Tim Nafziger, was in Toronto last week, when he found out about this statue, made a pilgrimage to it and took this picture of it. After taking the photo, he noted, "If I hadn't been looking for him, I would have bustled by, yet another passerby, never stopping to notice the nail marks in his feet." I think this image is a great exegesis of the unrecognized Christ that we're given on the Emmaus Road story. Secondly, and I think this is equally crucial, rather than standing idly among peaceable religious folk who are insulated and aloof from the world, that is, rather than having a mystical private experience of the risen Christ, in Luke's story, the risen Christ is moving alongside people who are in trouble because they have sought to change the world. And Jesus is in solidarity with these sorts of disciples particularly. I don't think we can make too much of this aspect of the Emmaus Road story, because after all, we activist types in churches, we're the ones who most often feel marginalized. And it is something about the risen Christ that first he would appear to women and next to disillusioned activists. I love that about the story. Thirdly, there's more. Jesus clearly is pastoral in this portrait, seeking to know the pain of those struggling with the specifically political context, rather than offering saccharine spiritual assurances of personal immunity from historical consequences. I think that's very, very important to our Christology, that Jesus really does care about our pain, but it's political pain as well as personal pain. And of course, finally, that Jesus is also prophetic. His biblical analysis surrounds a fierce prophetic hermeneutic in order to reframe the empire's historiography with the alternative story of transformation at the margins. How desperately we North American Christians need this Jesus to walk with us under our imperial shadow of death, and how urgent it is that we reread our Bibles and our history through the lens of the prophets. There's a fifth lesson that's deeply theological, and that is this. Earlier in Luke's Gospel, in fact, right about the midpoint of Luke's Gospel, in the famous story of Lazarus and Dives, that story ends with Father Abraham telling the rich man, "If you don't listen to Moses and the prophets, you won't be convinced even if someone rises from the dead." This is an extraordinary theological claim, and one that we need to hear over and over again in a church that believes that the resurrection rescues us from history, that the resurrection negates our efforts to try to heal the world, that the risen Jesus rises above our pain, cancels out the prophetic message. That is one of the ways that we get it all wrong. Luke wants it to make it very clear, both here in the Lazarus story and then again in the Easter story, that the resurrection points us back to the prophets. Only the prophets can help us make sense of our continuing history. Easter doesn't rescue us. Easter empowers us to embrace the way of the prophets. Now I want to invite everybody to take a big stretch. I said we had a lot to do today, and this is, we're in the final stretch here, but I know it's been already a long hour and 10 minutes, so I want to invite you to just stand up and stretch for a minute. and then we're going to listen to the prophets, our contemporary prophets, as a sort of trying to learn the lesson of the Emmaus Road. Obviously, for us in the United States anyway, the best way to live into this lesson of Emmaus Road is not only to build up our literacy on the left side of our Bible, the Hebrew Bible, but also to reread the texts of our own prophets. And our most compelling choice is surely Dr. Martin Luther King, who has already been in conversation with the Emmaus Road tonight. Specifically, I want to highlight two texts, both of which are having anniversaries this month. The first is his famous letter from Birmingham jail. Last week we celebrated the 50th anniversary of that amazing text, and we're not going to look at it in any detail here because that's going to be the task of our next webinar. So here's an advertisement that next month's webinar on Tuesday, May 7th is going to be revisiting the 50th anniversary of the great Birmingham campaign, which brought us not only King's letter from jail, but also the amazing Children's Crusade. Elaine and I took a pilgrimage to Birmingham a few years ago, and we're going to talk about what we learned and the ongoing legacy of that campaign. So we hope that as many of you as possible will join us next month, and tell your friends as we continue to investigate how to read history through the lens of the prophets. The other speech of King's that I would highlight, and when I say highlight, I want to invite us to reread these texts. And if you look up at your notes box, you'll see the URL of the letter from Birmingham jail. That's where you can find it online, as well as many, many other places. And also the text of the Beyond Vietnam speech. That's the other one that I want to highlight. Also, April, we had the anniversary, the 46th anniversary of what I think was the most consequential speech that Dr. King ever gave. So I want to just talk for a quick minute about this speech and give you just a few highlights of that speech in the hopes that you will revisit it yourself in your meditation, in your study groups, and so on. There are several salient points that King makes in this speech. This is, of course, when King came out publicly against the Indochina War for the first time. All of his advisors told him not to. They were afraid he would compromise the gains of the civil rights movement. But King was not a photo opportunity public leader. He was a prophet in the truest sense who followed his conscience and the dictates of history. So the first point he makes about the Vietnam War, which caused him to break his own silence, was what we would today call militaristic racism or poverty conscription, where he famously talked about black young men being taken from who had been crippled by U.S. society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Harlem. This is a theme that he sounded repeatedly in the last year of his life. Another point that he made that is a salient point is that the violence that the U.S. government was exhibiting in Indochina was a model that citizens would mimic, and therefore why should we critique those who were burning in inner cities as a protest to poverty and marginalization? This is a time in U.S. history where U.S. inner cities were burning every year during the summer. And King says, you want me to tell those brothers to only be nonviolent, but how can I say that to them when actually our government is exhibiting the wrong kind of behavior? That's a pretty sophisticated argument. And he concludes by saying, the questions that I face when I go talk to these brothers on the street hit home, and I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. Now I want to ask you, friends, can you imagine a single public figure in Canada or the U.S. today who would dare say something like this? My, how far we have come. A third point that King makes is about how the vocation of his Southern Christian Leadership Conference was nothing less than to save the soul of America. And here he really critiques imperialism, talking about America's soul being poisoned by its military adventures the world over. And then he says some pretty amazing things. He says, I want to say that something even more disturbing. The war in Vietnam is but a symptom of a far deeper malady within the American spirit. And if we ignore it, we will find ourselves organizing protest groups for the next generation. Well, that was truly prophetic, because that's exactly what we've done. We'll be concerned about Guatemala and Peru, Thailand and Cambodia, Mozambique and South Africa. We'll be marching for these and a dozen other names and attending rallies without end until there is significant and profound change in American life and policy. What an amazing and prescient, truly prophetic word that speaks to our condition, because truly we have had a litany of wars all over the world. Or as one wag puts it, it seems that war is the way in which Americans learn geography. Again, can we imagine a public figure being this bold? Certainly not now, especially with the U.S. Congress not even able to pass a very weak gun background check. It's amazing how courageous Dr. King was. It's no accident that exactly a year after delivering the speech, almost to the hour, he was assassinated by the U.S. government. But not only does he critique racism and militarism and imperialism, but also he has a vision of populist responsibility. The great initiative is ours. It must be our initiative to stop this war, he says. And then he goes on to say that people have to take power back from those who possess it without compassion, might without morality, strength without sight. What an amazing and continuingly relevant speech this was. And then he summarizes it toward the end of the speech with this line: we must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more valuable, more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, militarism, and materialism are incapable of being conquered. One could argue we have arrived at that point. And King wasn't afraid to call out the churches, calling out religious leaders to move beyond what he called the prophesying of smooth patriotism to the high grounds of a firm dissent based upon the mandates of conscience and the reading of history. Perhaps he hoped a new spirit is rising among us. Well, you got to understand that Dr. King was a Baptist, and so he wasn't about to finish without an altar call. And so he ended the Beyond Vietnam speech with this altar call, now let us begin. Let us rededicate ourselves to the long and bitter but beautiful struggle for a new world. But then he asked whether we would have the courage to do that. Would the struggle be too hard? Would our message be too bitter a pill to swallow? Would we truly embrace the message of longing, hope, and solidarity, whatever the cost? This is a picture of Dr. King's memorial stone underneath the balcony where he was gunned down. And as he concluded his altar call, the choice is ours. We might prefer it otherwise, but we must choose in this crucial moment of history. that always brings me to this epitaph that is at the place that is now the National Civil Rights Museum, that cites the great story in Genesis 37 of Joseph's brother saying, "Let us kill the dreamer and see what will become of his dream." That question really hangs over us in our church and in our nations like an unresolved chord. So to conclude, I want to cite one of my teachers and mentors in theology, Dr. Torvald Lorenzen, who says simply, the appreciation of the resurrection spells, the appreciation that the resurrection spells the end of the estranging powers of death, impels us to make the struggle for justice a priority. The concrete following of Jesus in our everyday life is the most adequate way of responding to the resurrection of the crucified Christ. This is still a battle we have to fight in our churches, where resurrection is about escaping the world or about triumphal victories rather than about reimagining the way of the prophets in our world. With us tonight, and we're going to go for about 10 more minutes, so hang in there, is Dr. Laura Brenneman, who's part of the Elkhart crew there. And Laura was kind enough at the last minute to agree to give a little bit of a response, and Charlita's going to try to see if she can connect Laura's audio and video so that Laura can give just a few thoughts that come to her mind as what she's heard. She's both a New Testament scholar and a professor of peace studies, so her work is right at the intersection of the kinds of themes that we've been talking about tonight. So Laura, welcome to the webinar. We're really glad that you're here, and I'm just going to turn it over to you. It sounds like we've got you. There you are. Welcome, and please talk to us. I'm going to mute my microphone.
Hi. Good. I think I am. I'm live, right? Well, first, I just wanted to say thank you so much. I've been thrilled and delighted to be part of this tonight, so thank you so much, Ted, and thanks for the great chat responses that all of you have been typing in, and we've had some great conversation here in the room tonight, too. So I think what has stuck with me the most as I've been thinking about everything you've been saying is one of your first questions about the domestication of Easter. And yeah, I really like the way that you framed the Emmaus Road story as a liturgy, I would say a liturgy of resistance that is really nice. I was thinking through some of the comments about one of the ways in which Easter becomes domesticated is staying in Good Friday, or moving to, I think some people were talking about moving too quickly from triumph to triumph, like Palm Sunday to Easter. And it seems to me one of the dangers on kind of the other side is to stay in the, I would say, the point of Good Friday that is, was kind of like the state that the two disciples were in on the road to Emmaus, that they were rightly in pain, not just personal pain, as you pointed out, but political pain too, but to have Jesus rebuke them for being foolish and slow of heart. And the way I read that is kind of a crisis of courage, in which, you know, a crisis of courage in the sense of not being able to fully understand what the resurrection implied. The courage that's implied with believing that in the face of in the face of the suffering of the world and being unwilling to close one's eyes to the suffering of the world, that instead you have courage to believe that God is actually stronger, and the resurrection showing that God vindicates Jesus and will act justly. So I guess the courage implies believing in the justice and justness of God. And of course then Jesus' act to interpret then the prophets, who of course were interpreting the same call that you're asking us to do, to interpret into our context. The prophets were doing that in their context too. What they considered to be very, very clear mandates for justice in the law that the people weren't getting. The foolishness and slowness of heart is not just a 21st century thing or a 1st century thing. It was an 8th century BCE thing and seems to be kind of a permanent human condition. And we need this sort of counterintuitive hope that infuses our courage. And so when I think about the domestication of Easter, I think about the domestication of Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and how, you were talking about sort of sugar coating or chocolate coating Easter. I think we certainly do that on what could be one of our greatest prophetic and politically, socially, economically challenging days of the year, Martin Luther King Day. And we kind of, I would say, have a crisis of courage apparent there too, or even a failure to recognize our own crisis of courage, believing that, or hoping that everything that needs to be done on behalf of justice has already been done. Boy, aren't we a great society now. So those are just some of my thoughts, and I really appreciate you pointing us to and taking us very carefully through the Emmaus Road story and talking about that as a liturgy, and I think it's a liturgy of resistance for sure. So.
Thank you very much, Laura. I really appreciate your coming on at short notice and for your own work that you're doing. And Joanna, the whole crew there, thanks for, there's Joanna. Thanks for basically being in on these webinars. I want to just open up, I know it's a little after 7:15, which is our normal closing time, but I just want to open up a few minutes to see if there's any pressing questions of clarification. You've all been typing your comments as we've been going, and we really appreciate that, but just want to make space in case there's any pressing questions. If so, madly type it in now. I want to again remind you that you've got resources here on your in the note box that have some links. I particularly want to call your attention to the link of an article. This is an article I wrote on the Beyond Vietnam talk a couple of years ago, and on the 40th anniversary of it, and you can download that for free off our website, so be sure and take advantage of that if you wish. Solveig's coming in, covered Luke 24 in a women's Bible study this morning. Wonder what you make of the act of hospitality at the heart of the chapter. Thank you, that's a great insight. Yeah, that's clearly hospitality to strangers is at the heart of this story, and it's also at the heart of the prophetic ethic. That prompts me to say that the modern sanctuary movement, known as the New Sanctuary Movement in the immigrants' rights movement, talks about prophetic hospitality as hospitality that particularly recognizes the politics of disenfranchisement among those who are undocumented. And So this story really does wed the prophetic tradition and the tradition of hospitality in a way that you're rightly pointing to. And of course, insofar as hospitality was largely seen as the role of women, not only offering it but making it happen, that's an aspect that needs to be a part of what is otherwise obviously a very, very male text in the case of the road to Emmaus. Thank you. We have time for maybe just one more question. Again, I want to remind you that as you can see in the chat box, our next webinar is May 7th on the 50th anniversary of the Birmingham campaign, and we hope you'll join us. Our webinars really depend on word of mouth. We don't have much of a marketing apparatus, but we had a good crew of more than 35 people signed up for the webinar. Some folks sign up for it, can't get on at the time, but will view the archive version. And that's a good reminder to say that you all will get a link sometime in the next few days of the archive version of this webinar, and you will have it to refer back to. So I want to thank everybody for your patience and participation. I hope you found the pauses for reflection and discussion useful, particularly those of you who have been in groups. And thank you for viewing these things together, and we hope that you'll carry on, drink some beer, have some good conversation late into the night. Particularly thanks to those of you on the Eastern time zones for whom this is already a very late hour. Jim Ball's always got a good question there in Ontario. Is there an echo in Luke 24 of the Nazareth sermon? Seems that Jesus began his ministry with Bible study that left people with a burning stomachs. That's really nicely put, Jim. Jim's just such a great reader of the Bible and knowing how to relate text. And this very clearly is, Jim, I would agree, this is a framing of the entire gospel story between two very upsetting, perplexing Bible studies. Thank you for that insight. And again, Tom, I think Charlita is answering your question. So you can, anything that is up here you'll get in the archive version, and you can view it at your own pace and take down notes, copy and paste them into your own notes and so on. So, well, thank you, everybody. Again, we want to leave you with another piece of Emmaus Road music on the way out. Thanks so much for being part of the webinar, and we will see you next time. Peace.
Have you ever said goodbye to a hero? Have you ever had to lay away your dreams? Have you ever been so lonely that a stranger's your best friend?